Princess Aelira stood at the highest balcony of the royal palace, her eyes gazing out at the vast expanse of her father's kingdom. The skies were a dark purple, stretching endlessly over the glowing cities below. But in her heart, she felt trapped. Aelira was the daughter of King Zorath, the most powerful ruler in the galaxy. His name was known in every star system, and his strength was feared by all. But Aelira was nothing like him. She had never been strong. As a child, her body had failed her. She couldn't run fast, couldn't lift heavy objects, and couldn't even defend herself when enemies attacked her kingdom. Her weakness was the one thing that made her stand out in a family of warriors. While her father, the king, trained from childhood to be the fiercest fighter in the galaxy, Aelira had spent her days in the palace, protected but ignored. She wanted to be strong, to fight alongside her father and her people, but every attempt had ended in failure. Each time she tried to practice with weapons, they were too heavy. Her body, fragile and slow, refused to cooperate. Her father's disappointment was always clear, and the people of the kingdom whispered about her weakness behind her back. One evening, as Aelira stood at the balcony, lost in her thoughts, the heavy door to her chamber opened. King Zorath entered, his tall frame casting a shadow in the dim light. "Aelira," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "Come, we have much to discuss." Aelira turned, her heart racing. She knew what was coming. Her father had never been one to show affection. Every word he spoke carried the weight of his expectations, and Aelira could never live up to them. "What is it, father?" she asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. Zorath's expression was unreadable as he stepped closer. "I have made a decision," he began. "Your weakness is a problem. Your inability to fight, to protect yourself, to be of any use to this kingdom. It is an embarrassment." Aelira's heart sank. She had heard these words before, but they still stung. He continued, "But I have a solution. There is a human mercenary who could help you. He has earned the respect of many. He is a warrior, strong and capable. I will offer you to him as a peace treaty between our people." Aelira's breath caught in her throat. The thought of being handed over to a stranger was unbearable, but she could say nothing. Her father was the king, and his word was law. "Father, please," Aelira said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to be a burden. I want to fight. I want to be strong." Her father's eyes narrowed. "Strength is earned, Aelira. It is not something you can wish for. If you want to survive, if you want to prove yourself to me, then you will follow this path." Aelira's head lowered, defeated. She had no choice. This was her future, one where her weakness was no longer hers to bear alone. The king's gaze softened for just a moment, but only for a brief second. "The human mercenary is named Ethan. He is known for his skill in battle. You will travel with him, learn from him. Perhaps in time, you will become the warrior your kingdom needs." Aelira felt a rush of emotions, fear, anger, sadness, but mostly a deep feeling of shame. She was being offered like a piece of property. "I will go," Aelira said quietly, her voice barely audible. She had no other choice. Her father nodded, turning to leave. But before he left, he looked back at her with a final command. "Do not fail me, Aelira. This is your last chance." The door closed with a heavy thud, and Aelira stood alone, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her heart raced as she tried to process everything. The king's words echoed in her mind. "This is your last chance." Aelira didn't know what she expected. Maybe a chance to prove herself, a chance to become someone her father could be proud of. But this, being handed over to a stranger like a gift or a prize, it felt wrong. The next morning, Aelira's journey began. She was escorted to the human's ship, a large, sleek vessel that seemed out of place among the ancient stone buildings of the royal palace. The ship was filled with soldiers, each one a hardened warrior with scars and battle-hardened eyes. They barely glanced at her as she boarded, some whispering to each other but most ignoring her completely. Aelira took her seat, feeling small and out of place among these warriors. She was no fighter, no soldier. She was a princess who had never known what it meant to be truly strong. As the ship took off, Alira looked out the window. Her kingdom, her father's palace, became smaller and smaller until it was just a dot in the vastness of space. She felt an overwhelming sense of loss. Would she ever return? Would she ever be the warrior her father dreamed of? A few hours later, the ship landed on a barren planet, a world far from the safety of her home. Alira was greeted by Ethan, the human mercenary who was to be her teacher and protector. He was tall, with short, dark hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through her. "Princess," he said with a nod, his voice calm and steady. "I'll be training you, so get ready." Alira nodded, unsure of what to say. There was no use arguing or resisting. She was here now, and she would have to endure whatever came next. Ethan didn't waste time with small talk. He led her to the training ground, a dusty, open area with weapons of all kinds scattered around. The other soldiers watched, curious, but not kind. "Pick up a weapon," Ethan instructed. "Let's see what you're made of." Alira hesitated. She had never touched a weapon before, had never even held a sword, but she couldn't let herself show weakness. Not again. She picked up a sword, awkwardly holding it in both hands. It felt heavy in her grip. She swung it, but it barely moved through the air. Ethan watched her carefully, then stepped forward. "No good. You're going to have to do better than that." Alira's face turned red with embarrassment. She wanted to scream, to throw the sword down and run away, but she didn't. She couldn't. Not anymore. She tightened her grip on the sword, determined to learn, determined to prove she could be more than what her father thought her to be. The sun dipped low in the sky as the days passed on the barren planet. Princess Alira had never felt so far from home. The vastness of the desert-like world around her seemed endless. But it wasn't the land that made her feel small. It was the fear that clung to her like a second skin. Since arriving, Alira had kept to herself, watching the soldiers around her with nervous eyes. They were not like the people of her kingdom, who had always treated her with care despite her weakness. The soldiers here were rough, hardened by countless battles. They didn't care about her royal status or her name. To them, she was just another burden. Ethan, the human mercenary who had been assigned to train her, was a man of few words. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't kind either. He was efficient, focused only on the task at hand. He never asked about her past or her feelings. He just wanted her to become stronger. Each morning he would wake her before dawn, forcing her out of bed to face the harsh realities of his training. The sun was still hidden beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the training grounds. The air was cold, but Alira's heart burned with fear and uncertainty. Ethan had handed her a simple wooden sword on her first day. "This is the only weapon you're getting for now," he had said, his voice low but firm. "You will learn to fight with it or die trying." It sounded like a threat, but Alira had seen something in his eyes, a flicker of care hidden beneath the surface. But it didn't matter. His words made it clear that her survival was her responsibility, and she had no choice but to obey. For the first few days she struggled with the basics. Her movements were slow, her muscles weak from years of neglect. She could barely swing, the sword without it feeling like an anchor dragging her down. Ethan watched her, standing silently as she tried again and again, her breath coming in short bursts. He didn't offer encouragement, he just waited for her to get up and try once more. "Faster!" he barked whenever she slowed down, pushing her further and further. Alira's hands bled. Her arms shook with exhaustion, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Every time she failed, it felt like the weight of the world pressed down on her shoulders, reminding her of how weak she was, how unworthy she had always been. Again! Ethan's voice cut through the silence, each command like a whip lashing at her spirit. He gave no time for rest, no time for pity. She had seen the other soldiers watching her, their faces unreadable. Some were amused by her struggle, others indifferent, but none offered any help. Alira often wondered if they saw her as a failure, just as she had always seen herself. She was a princess, but here she was nothing more than a novice, trying to survive in a world where weakness had no place. As the days wore on, she grew more determined. Every time she stumbled, she forced herself to stand back up. Every time. The sword slipped from her hands. She picked it up again, hands shaking, heart pounding. She refused to give up. Ethan wasn't always there, but when he did appear, he would watch her from a distance, making sure she was practicing. One evening, as the two of them sat together around a small campfire, Alira dared to ask a question that had been nagging at her for days. She glanced at Ethan, his face lit by the flickering firelight, and hesitated for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "Why are you training me? I'm a princess. I shouldn't even be here." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He simply stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. Alira's heart sank. She wasn't sure why she had expected an answer. She had always been told that strength came from the bloodline, from noble birth. But it wasn't her blood that mattered here. It was her ability to fight. And she had none. After a long pause, Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm but with a hint of something deeper. "Because you have something more than they realize," he said, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in what felt like forever. "You have something inside you that they don't see. You just have to find it." Alira felt a strange warmth at his words. But doubt crept in almost immediately. Could she really become someone else? Could she really be more than the weak princess who had been offered as a prize? The nights were cold on this strange planet, and the stars above seemed so far away. But Alira found herself lying awake, staring up at the sky, thinking about what Ethan had said. What did he mean by something inside you? She didn't understand. She had always been told she was weak, incapable. How could she possibly change now? But something in her stirred deep within her chest. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe she could be more than her father's disappointment. The next morning, Alira returned to the training grounds with a new resolve. She took up the wooden sword once more, her grip tighter than before. She was going to prove to herself that she could do this. She fought through the fatigue, pushing herself harder than she ever had before. Her arms burned, and her muscles screamed in protest. But she didn't stop. She swung the sword, her movements slightly more controlled, her body a little less stiff. Ethan stood watching her, his arms crossed. His gaze was sharp, assessing. But he didn't say anything. Alira felt his eyes on her, but it didn't scare her. For the first time since she arrived on this planet, she felt like she had control over her own destiny. "Good," Ethan finally said, his voice low and approving. "You're getting better." It was a small compliment, but to Alira, it meant everything. It was the first time someone had recognized her efforts. It was the first time she had felt like she was moving forward, not backward. That evening, after another long day of training, Alira finally allowed herself a moment of rest. She sat alone, looking out at the vast desert landscape. The stars above twinkled brightly as if they were winking at her. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as weak as she had always believed. And maybe, just maybe, she could rise again. Days turned into weeks and the harsh training continued. Alira was no longer the weak, timid princess who had arrived on the barren planet. Her muscles were sore, her body covered in bruises and cuts from the constant battles with the wooden sword. But now something had changed inside her. The weak, frightened girl who had once been offered as a prize was slowly being replaced by someone stronger, someone who wasn't afraid of facing the challenges ahead. It wasn't easy, though. Every morning the sun barely rose before Ethan had her up and moving. The harsh winds of the desert planet blew dust and sand into her face, but she kept her head down, focused on her training. Ethan was relentless. He pushed her harder each day, making her practice everything over and over again. But his words, though few, had begun to sink into her heart. "You have to fight for yourself, Alira. No one will do it for you." That was the core of everything Ethan had taught her. There were no shortcuts, no magic spells that would make her a warrior. She had to earn it with sweat, pain, and persistence. One morning, after an especially grueling session of swordplay, Alira sat on a rock, catching her breath. The sun was high in the sky now, the heat unbearable. Her arms trembled from the exertion, but she didn't rest. She stood up slowly and faced Ethan, who was watching her quietly from a distance. "Are we done for today?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Ethan shook his head. "No, I want you to run to the top of that hill, and back, without stopping." Elira turned her head to look at the steep hill in the distance. It was tall, its peak barely visible against the bright sky. She swallowed, fear creeping up her spine. She had no idea how she would make it to the top, let alone run all the way back. "You can do it," Ethan said, as if reading her mind. "Don't think about how hard it is, just do it." With a deep breath, Elira nodded and started her run. Her feet sank into the loose sand as she sprinted, the hot wind stinging her face. Her heart raced as she climbed the hill, her legs burning with every step. She told herself not to stop, even though the pain was almost unbearable. She pushed through it, remembering Ethan's words. Just do it. The hill seemed to stretch on forever, but eventually, Elira reached the top. She stood there panting, looking down at the landscape below. For the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt before, a sense of accomplishment, but she couldn't stop there. She had to run back. The journey down the hill was no easier. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, and the burning in her chest didn't go away. But she didn't stop. She kept moving, each step a little slower than the last. But she kept moving. When she finally reached the bottom, she collapsed onto the sand, exhausted beyond belief. But Ethan was there, watching her closely. "You didn't stop," he said quietly, offering her a hand to help her up. Elira took his hand and stood shakily. "I thought I was going to die," she admitted, breathless. Ethan smiled slightly. "You didn't, and that's what matters." Over the next few days, Elira felt stronger, not just physically, but mentally as well. Her mind was sharper, her focus more intense. Ethan's training was starting to pay off. Every time she swung the sword, it felt a little less awkward. Every time she ran, her endurance grew. She had come so far from the weak princess she had once been. But there was still one thing that plagued her: doubt. In the stillness of the night, Elira often lay awake in her tent, staring at the dark sky. Was this really enough? She would wonder. Could she really be a fighter? Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "You are weak. You are a disappointment." She squeezed her eyes shut, pushing the thought away. "No, I'm not weak. I am not a disappointment." But the doubt still lingered, like a shadow she couldn't shake. One afternoon, as the group of soldiers prepared for a raid on a nearby enemy camp, Elira stood with Ethan, her heart racing. This was the real test. She had fought in training, but this would be her first real battle. "Stay close to me," Ethan instructed, his voice low. "I'll guide you through it." Elira nodded, but her hands were already slick with sweat. The fear she had tried to push away was back, stronger than ever. What if she failed? What if she froze in the heat of battle? The enemy camp was just over the horizon, a collection of tents and makeshift buildings. As they approached, the tension in the air was thick, and Elira could hear the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. "Remember everything I taught you," Ethan whispered. "Focus. Don't let fear control you." The first wave of enemies came charging toward them, weapons drawn. Elira's heart stopped. They were huge, terrifying creatures, covered in armor and snarling like beasts. But this time, Elira didn't back down. She drew her sword, her grip tight, and held her ground. She swung the sword at the nearest enemy, her movements sharp and quick. For a moment she thought she had missed, but the enemy staggered back, blood spilling from the wound. Elira's eyes widened in shock. She had done it. But there was no time to celebrate. More enemies came at her, and Elira fought with everything she had. Her body moved on instinct, her training kicking in as she parried, dodged, and struck with deadly precision. She felt powerful. For the first time, she didn't feel like the weak, helpless princess. She was a warrior. The battle was fierce, but Elira held her ground. She didn't hesitate. She fought with the same intensity as Ethan, and it was clear that she had come a long way. When the dust finally settled, Elira stood panting, her body bruised but unbroken. She looked around at the fallen enemies, her heart still racing. It was over. She had survived. Ethan walked up to her, a look of approval in his eyes. "Well done," he said simply. Elira could hardly believe it. She had done it. She had faced her fears and come out victorious. It wasn't just the battle that had changed her. It was the fact that she had believed in herself for the first time. And that made all the difference. The days following the raid were filled with quiet moments of reflection for Elira. She had proven herself in battle, but now the tension seemed to hang in the air, as if something more was waiting for her. It was clear that Ethan believed in her, and the soldiers around her showed signs of respect, but Elira knew there was still much more to prove. The doubt in her heart, though quieter now, still lingered like an unwelcome shadow. Her training intensified as the days passed, and Ethan began to push her even harder. She no longer felt like the weak, uncertain princess from the day she had arrived. Her body was stronger, more agile. The pain of training had become a familiar companion. She could feel the changes in herself, but there was always that whisper in the back of her mind. Am I ready? One evening, after a long day of training, Elira sat on the steps outside the campfire watching the sunset. The colors painted the sky in shades of red and purple, but her mind was far from peaceful. She hadn't heard from her father in weeks, and the weight of his expectations seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. She could still hear his voice from that fateful day when he had offered her to Ethan. "Do not fail me, Elira." She knew her father was waiting for her to prove herself, but every step she took felt like a heavy burden she could barely carry. Suddenly, Ethan appeared beside her, his steps quiet on the sand. He sat down next to her without a word, letting the silence stretch between them for a moment. Elira glanced at him, wondering what was on his mind. "You've come a long way," Ethan said finally, his voice calm and steady. Elira gave a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I don't know if it's enough," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply nodded, as if he understood exactly what she was feeling. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, Elira saw something in them that she hadn't seen before. A flicker of something deeper, something more personal. "You've done more than most ever would," he said, his words like a quiet affirmation. "But now, there's a new challenge ahead of you." Elira raised an eyebrow. "What kind of challenge?" Ethan's gaze was intense as he spoke. "Your father has sent word. He wants you to face a champion from the enemy side in a duel. It's a test, a way for you to prove that you're worthy of being called a fighter." Elira's breath caught in her throat. Her hands clenched into fists, and for a moment she felt a wave of panic wash over her. "A duel?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "But Ethan cut her off. "You've trained for this. You've learned how to fight. You don't need to be afraid." But Elira couldn't shake the feeling of dread that gripped her chest. A duel was unlike anything she had faced before. This wasn't training. This wasn't just sparring with wooden swords or dodging attacks in practice. This was real. Her heart raced, and she could feel the doubt creeping back into her mind. What if I fail? What if I'm not strong enough? Ethan noticed the change in her demeanor. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm but reassuring. "I've seen you grow, Elira. You've already overcome more than you ever thought possible. This duel isn't just about winning. It's about proving to yourself that you can face anything and stand tall." Elira looked at him, searching his face for any hint of doubt. But there was none. His confidence in her was clear, and it was enough to push her forward, even if only for a moment. "How do I prepare for this?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Ethan stood up, offering his hand to help her to her feet. "We train harder," he said simply. "We prepare you to face the champion, and we make sure you're ready for whatever comes." For the next few days, Elira's training became even more intense. Ethan worked with her tirelessly, sharpening her swordplay, improving her reflexes, and focusing on her mental strength. He pushed her harder than he ever had before, but there was something different this time. It wasn't just about the physical challenge, it was about her mindset. Every time Alira started to doubt herself, Ethan was there to remind her that she was stronger than she knew. "Don't think about your fear," he would say. "Focus on your enemy. Focus on what you need to do to survive." Alira's mind became more focused. She learned how to block out the fear, how to stay calm in the face of overwhelming odds. But even as she improved, she knew that the real test was still ahead of her. The duel was coming, and she had to face it, whether she was ready or not. Finally, the day arrived. The air was thick with tension as Alira, dressed in simple armor, stood before the large arena where the duel would take place. The ground beneath her feet was hard and unforgiving, and the heat of the sun beat down relentlessly on her shoulders. The crowd of soldiers gathered around, their eyes fixed on the center of the arena. Alira's opponent, a massive alien warrior, stood across from her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in thick armor that gleamed under the sun. His eyes were cold, filled with the same arrogance that Alira had seen in her father's kingdom before. He was the champion, a fighter who had never been defeated. Alira felt a rush of fear, but she remembered Ethan's words. "Focus on your enemy. Focus on what you need to do to survive." The horn sounded, and the duel began. Alira took a deep breath and tightened her grip on her sword. She wasn't sure what would happen, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to back down. She was ready to face whatever came her way. The first strike came quickly. The alien champion swung his massive sword at her with incredible speed. Alira barely managed to block the blow, the force of it knocking her back a few steps, but she didn't fall. She kept her balance, her focus sharp. For the next few minutes, the two warriors clashed again and again, their swords meeting in a shower of sparks. Alira's arms burned with the effort, but she refused to let her guard down. The alien warrior was stronger, but she was faster. She used his size against him, dodging his attacks and striking whenever she found an opening. Then, in a moment of sheer instinct, Alira saw her chance. As the champion lunged toward her, she sidestepped, and, with a swift movement, she thrust her sword into his side. He staggered, his grip on his weapon loosening. The crowd fell silent as the alien champion fell to his knees, his weapon slipping from his hand. Alira stood tall, her chest rising and falling with each breath. She had done it. She had faced her fear and won. Ethan, standing at the edge of the arena, nodded in approval. For the first time, Alira truly believed in herself. The tension in the air was thick. Alira stood in the center of the arena, her breath coming in steady rhythmic gasps. The sunlight beat down on her, but it barely registered. Her focus was on the towering figure before her, the enemy champion. Alien before her was a monster, clad in heavy shining armor, his shoulders broad and his stance imposing. His eyes were cold, filled with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. His weapon, a large double-bladed axe, gleamed in the harsh light of the sun. Alira's sword felt lighter than it had ever felt before, but she knew this was no ordinary fight. This was a test, not just for her strength, but for her spirit. The eyes of the soldiers around her burned with expectation. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, telling her that this was her moment. "Do not fail me." The horn sounded, and the duel began. The champion charged forward with incredible speed, his axe raised high above his head. Alira barely had time to react. The first swing came down hard, and she barely managed to raise her sword in time to block it. The force of the blow sent a shockwave through her arms, and she staggered back, but her feet stayed planted. She took a deep breath. "Focus," she reminded herself. "Stay calm." The champion didn't give her a chance to rest. He swung again, faster, this time aiming for her head. Alira ducked just in time, the axe missing her by inches. The dust kicked up as the blade struck the ground, and Alira used the moment of distraction to dart forward. She aimed a quick thrust at his side, but the champion's armor absorbed the blow with ease. He grunted, turning toward her with a snarl on his face. "You think you can beat me, princess?" he growled. His voice was deep and mocking, as if he already knew the outcome of the fight. Elira's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't let his words shake her. This wasn't just a fight to survive. It was a fight to prove who she had become. She wasn't the weak princess anymore. She wasn't the girl who had been offered like a prize. She was a fighter, and she would show the world that she could stand her ground. The champion lunged at her once more, swinging the massive axe with brutal force. Elira ducked and weaved, narrowly avoiding the deadly arc of the blade. She could feel the heat of the battle now, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Every movement, every decision felt more fluid, more instinctual. Her training with Ethan had paid off, and now she could feel it in her bones. But the champion wasn't slowing down. He kept coming at her with all his might, his swings fast and heavy. Each time she dodged, he adjusted, trying to anticipate her next move. It was clear he underestimated her, thinking that she was just a weak princess. But Elira had learned more than how to swing a sword. She had learned patience, strategy, and, most importantly, the strength to keep fighting. She feinted to the left, causing the champion to swing his axe in that direction, but Elira quickly stepped to the right, moving behind him. She seized the opportunity, bringing her sword up with all her might and aiming for the weak spot in his armor, the gap where his chest plate didn't meet the rest of his gear. Her sword connected with a loud clang, and the champion let out a pained grunt. The blow had been a glancing strike, but it was enough to cause him to stumble. Elira's heart raced. She had done it. For a split second, she saw his guard drop, and that was all she needed. She swung her sword again, this time aiming for the joint in his armor. The blade slid into the gap, cutting through the weak point in the metal. The champion cried out in pain as he staggered back, his weapon slipping from his grasp. Elira stood tall, her chest heaving with exertion, her sword raised high. This was it. The champion fell to his knees, his face twisted in rage and disbelief. The crowd around them was silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Elira could hear her own breathing, the pounding of her heart in her ears. She stood there for a moment, her mind racing. "Finish it," the champion spat, his voice full of venom. "Do it." But Elira didn't strike immediately. She knew what her father would have expected, an execution, a swift end to the fight. But she wasn't her father. She wasn't the same person who had arrived on this planet so many weeks ago. She had learned something in the time since then. She stepped back, lowering her sword. The crowd around them began to murmur, uncertain of what was happening. Ethan, standing on the sidelines, gave her a sharp look, but Elira remained focused. "You're beaten," Elira said, her voice steady. "And I will not kill you." The champion's eyes widened with surprise, and for a moment, Elira thought he might laugh. But instead, he simply bowed his head, defeated. He had underestimated her, and now he knew the truth. Elira turned her back to him and faced the crowd. The arena was silent for a long moment. She could feel their eyes on her, their judgment hanging in the air. Had she made the right choice? Had she shown them enough? Then, slowly, the crowd began to clap. The sound grew louder, echoing through the arena until it was a thunderous roar. The soldiers who had once whispered behind her back now cheered for her. She had proven herself, not just with her sword, but with her heart. Ethan walked up to her, a proud smile on his face. "You did it," he said, his voice full of approval. Elira looked at him, a sense of peace settling over her. "I didn't just fight him," she said quietly. "I fought myself." Ethan nodded. "That's the hardest battle anyone can face." As the cheers of the soldiers echoed around her, Elira allowed herself a small, proud smile. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free. She had faced the greatest challenge she had ever known, and had come out victorious. But this victory was different. It wasn't just about winning the duel. It was about showing the world, and herself, that she was no longer the weak princess who had been handed over as a prize. She was a warrior, and this was only the beginning. The cheers of the soldiers echoed in Alira's ears as she stood victorious in the arena. She had won the duel, not only proving her strength but her character. Her heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline still rushing through her veins, but there was something more, something deep within her that felt different. For the first time, Alira believed in herself. The battle with the enemy champion had been intense, but now, standing amidst the crowd, Alira could see the difference in the way they looked at her. The soldiers no longer saw her as the weak princess who was handed over like a peace offering. They saw her as a warrior, someone who could fight, survive, and win. Ethan stood by her side, his expression proud but calm. He hadn't said much during the fight, but Alira could see the approval in his eyes. It meant more to her than any praise she could have received from anyone else. "You did well," he said, his voice steady. "Better than I thought you would." Alira smiled, though it was a tired smile. "I did what I had to do." Ethan nodded. "That's what makes you different. You fight not for glory but for the people who depend on you. That's what true warriors do." The words sank into Alira's mind as she processed them. She had learned so much in such a short time. It wasn't just about the physical skills, though those were important. It was about understanding why she fought. She fought for herself. She fought for her people. And she fought because she refused to let anyone, including herself, define her by her weakness. As the crowd began to disperse, Alira felt a strange sense of peace. The moment she had feared had passed. The pressure, the doubt, the expectation, it had all melted away with the final clash of swords. But something else had taken its place. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but it felt like freedom. That night, as the stars filled the sky above the camp, Alira sat alone by the fire, her mind racing. Her journey had only just begun. She had faced the challenge of the duel, but there would be more battles ahead, both on the battlefield and within herself. Ethan found her sitting there, staring into the fire. He sat beside her without a word, the warmth of the flames dancing across their faces. "You know, I never imagined you would make it this far," Ethan said after a long pause, his voice calm and contemplative. "But you've proven something important. You've proven that you can change. You've proven that you're not the person everyone thought you were." Alira looked at him, her eyes soft but determined. "I don't want to be the person everyone thinks I should be. I want to be someone I can be proud of." Ethan smiled, and for the first time, Alira saw a hint of warmth in his eyes. "That's the first step. Keep that mindset, and you'll go far." The night passed quietly, and Alira fell into a deep sleep. When she awoke, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm golden light across the camp. She stretched, feeling the familiar soreness in her muscles, but this time, it didn't bother her. It was a reminder of how far she had come. Her morning routine was the same, but now there was a new energy in her step. Ethan had always been there, pushing her forward, teaching her to be more than just a princess. But now, she was ready to take the next step on her own. As the days passed, Alira became more and more confident in her abilities. She spent hours each day training, refining her swordplay, her strategy, and her mind. She was no longer the weak girl who had arrived at the camp. She was a fighter, and every day she grew stronger. One afternoon, as she practiced with her sword, a familiar figure appeared in the distance. It was her father's messenger, a tall, armored soldier who approached with urgency. Alira's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't heard from her father since the day she had left the palace. What could he possibly want now? The soldier walked up to Alira, bowing his head respectfully. "Princess Alira, your father has sent for you. He wishes to speak with you." Alira's stomach tightened. She had no idea what this meeting would entail, but she had no choice. It was her duty to return, to face her father's judgment. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever was to come. "Tell him I will meet him," she said, her voice steady, despite the uncertainty swirling in her chest. The soldier nodded and turned to leave, but Aelira stopped him before he could go. "One more thing," she said, her voice firm. "Tell my father that I am no longer the girl he once knew. I have earned my place, and I will no longer be his disappointment." The soldier stared at her for a moment, his eyes wide with surprise, but he said nothing, simply nodding before turning and walking away. Aelira watched him go, feeling the weight of her words settle in her heart. She wasn't the same person she had been when she left the palace. She was a warrior now, and she would face whatever came next with the strength she had built for herself. Later that day, Aelira mounted her horse and rode toward the place where she would meet her father. Her mind was full of thoughts of the battles she had fought, of the growth she had experienced, and of the strength she had found within herself. When she finally arrived at the palace, she dismounted and walked into the grand hall. The air was thick with the familiar tension of royalty, but Aelira no longer felt small. She held her head high, walking toward the throne where her father sat, his cold eyes watching her approach. "Aelira," her father said, his voice as stern as ever. "You've returned. I trust you've learned your place." Aelira stood tall before him, her eyes unwavering. "I have learned my place, father, but it's not the place you expected." The king raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. "Explain yourself." "I am not the weak princess you left behind," Aelira said, her voice steady. "I have become something more. I've fought, I've survived, and I've earned my strength, and I am ready to stand beside you, not beneath you." The king studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching for any sign of doubt, any weakness. But there was none. Aelira stood before him, not as a princess, but as a warrior. Finally the king spoke. "You have proven yourself, Aelira. I did not think you had it in you. Perhaps you are more than I gave you credit for." Aelira nodded, but she did not smile. She had learned that true strength wasn't in seeking approval. It was in knowing who you were and standing firm in that knowledge. As the king spoke of the future, Aelira listened, but her thoughts were already on the road, ahead. She had come this far and she wasn't turning back. The journey was just beginning.